It happened at 4:35 in the morning, Pacific time, while the Oregon coast was still asleep. Out in the dark, about 135 miles past the breakers off the town of Bandon, the floor of the Pacific Ocean tore sideways. A magnitude 5.5 earthquake. Then, barely an hour later, the same patch of seafloor cracked again. And here is the strange part. The fault that moved that morning is not the fault you should be afraid of. That's the thing almost nobody is saying out loud. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what broke off the Oregon coast on June 29th, why the United States Geological Survey logged it but didn't lose any sleep over it, and why the truly dangerous fault sat just 200 kilometers away, completely silent, while this one made all the noise. You'll understand the difference between a fault that shouts and a fault that whispers, and you'll understand why the whisper is the one that can kill 14,000 people. This is the Horizon Lab, where we take the headline that scares you and we hand you the real science underneath it, because the truth, almost always, is stranger and more unsettling than the conspiracy. Let's get into it. If you're new here, do me one favor before we start. Hit subscribe, because we go this deep on a real event every single week. And in the comments, tell me where you're watching from. Oregon, Washington, somewhere that's never felt the ground move in your life? I want to know, because by the end of this, the map of who should be paying attention is going to surprise you. So let's go back to that morning. A magnitude 5.5 is not a small earthquake. If that had struck under a city, you'd have cracked plaster, broken windows, things shaken off shelves. People would have run into the street. But this one struck under more than 2 miles of cold seawater, far out past the edge of the continent, in a place with no buildings, no roads, and no people. The only things that felt it directly were the seismometers. About 16 people on shore reported a faint, rolling sensation. Most of the coast slept right through it. The National Tsunami Warning Center looked at it within minutes and issued the all-clear. No tsunami, no threat. By breakfast, it was a footnote on a few local news sites and nothing more. And that, right there, is where the real story hides. Because when a magnitude 5.5 cracks open off the coast of Oregon, your instinct, my instinct, everybody's instinct, is to ask one question. Is this it? Is this the beginning of the big one? The Cascadia earthquake everyone in the Pacific Northwest has been warned about for 30 years. The one that's supposed to drop the coastline, send a wall of water inland, and rewrite the map from Northern California to Vancouver Island. The honest answer is no, this was not that. This wasn't even on the same fault. But the reason it wasn't, the reason seismologists could look at this quake and stay calm, is a far more interesting story than any doomsday video will ever tell you. Because to understand why this earthquake didn't matter, you have to understand the one that does. And it's been getting ready, in total silence, for 325 years. Let's get specific, because specifics are how you separate real science from fear. The earthquake struck on June 29, 2026, at 11:35 in the morning Universal Time, which is 4:35 in the morning on the Oregon coast. The United States Geological Survey put the magnitude at 5.5 and gave it an event identifier, US 6000 T8YT. If you want, you can pull it up yourself. That's the thing about this channel. Every number I give you comes from an agency you can check. The location was about 218 kilometers, roughly 135 miles, due west of Bandon, Oregon. The depth was around 10 kilometers, about 6 miles down, shallow as these things go. And then, about an hour later, an aftershock, roughly magnitude 3.9 in the same spot, on the same structure, smaller, a reminder, the ground settling its accounts after the main event. Now, here's a number that matters more than the magnitude, 218 kilometers offshore. That distance is the whole story. Put a pin in it, because we're coming back to it. The Geological Survey ran its usual products, the shake map, which models how hard the ground shook and where. The Did You Feel It survey, which collects reports from real people, and the answer that came back was barely, about 16 responses. A maximum felt intensity somewhere around a 3 on the modified Mercalli scale, which is the kind of shaking you might mistake for a heavy truck rolling past your house. If you were standing on the Oregon coast that morning, you almost certainly felt nothing at all. So why are we spending an hour on an earthquake almost nobody felt? Because of where it was, not how big it was. Where? This quake didn't happen on some random patch of ocean floor. It happened on one of the most active, most misunderstood faults on the entire west coast of North America. A fault most people have never heard of, even though it slips and cracks and swarms with earthquakes year after year after year. It has a name that sounds almost gentle, the Blanco Fracture Zone. And the Blanco has a secret. It sits right next to the deadliest fault in the United States, close enough that every time it moves, people panic. Close enough that the two are forever getting confused, but they are not the same. They don't work the same way. They don't fail the same way. One of them is a loudmouth that goes off constantly and hurts no one. The other says nothing for centuries and then ends an era. To understand why this morning was a non-event, and why the next one might not be, you have to understand what's actually happening down there. 3 slabs of the planet's outer shell grinding against each other in the cold and the dark, off a coastline where 8 million Americans live. Let's go down and look. The surface of the Earth is not one solid piece. It's broken into a few dozen rigid slabs called tectonic plates, and they're all moving, slowly, constantly, riding on the hot, slow-flowing rock beneath them. Most of the time you don't notice, a few centimeters a year, about as fast as your fingernails grow. But when 2 plates are locked together and that motion has to go somewhere, it comes out all at once. That's an earthquake. Off the coast of Oregon, you don't have 2 plates meeting, you have 3, and the way they meet is the key to this entire story. There's the giant Pacific Plate, the largest on Earth, grinding off to the northwest. There's the North American Plate, the continent you're probably standing on right now. And wedged between them, small and young and frankly a little doomed, is a slab called the Juan de Fuca Plate, along with its southern cousin, the Gorda Plate. These little plates are the leftovers of a much bigger one that's been slowly disappearing under North America for millions of years. Now, where these plates meet, they do different things in different places. And this is the part you have to get, because it's the whole difference between a quake that matters and one that doesn't. In some places, plates slide past each other, sideways, like 2 cars scraping door to door on a narrow road. Geologists call that a transform boundary. The rock grinds, it sticks, it lets go, you get an earthquake, but the seafloor doesn't move up or down very much. It just shifts horizontally. In other places, one plate dives down underneath another. The heavier oceanic plate bends and slides beneath the lighter continent, down into the deep earth. That's called subduction. And a subduction boundary is where you get the absolute monsters, the magnitude 9s. Because when that kind of fault finally lets go, it doesn't just shift sideways, it thrusts the whole seafloor upward, and that vertical jolt is what launches a tsunami. The Blanco Fracture Zone, the fault that cracked that morning, is the first kind, a transform. 2 plates sliding past each other, sideways, in the dark. It's about 350 kilometers long, running roughly east to west, and it connects 2 underwater volcanic ridges, the Juan de Fuca Ridge and the Gorda Ridge, where brand new ocean crust is being born. The Blanco is the seam between them. The plates on either side slide past at a couple of centimeters a year, a little faster on its eastern end. It is right lateral, which just means if you stood on one side and looked across, the far side would creep to your right. Here's the analogy I want you to hold on to. The Blanco Fracture Zone is 2 hands pressed flat together, palm to palm, sliding past each other. They catch, they jerk, they make noise, but they stay in the same plane. Nothing lifts, nothing drops. Now hold that thought, because 200 kilometers to the east, under the edge of the continent, there's a different kind of fault entirely. One hand isn't sliding past the other. One hand is being shoved underneath, slowly, for 3 centuries. And when it finally slips, it won't slide sideways. It'll lift the entire ocean. That's the fault we're really here to talk about. But first, you need to understand why the Blanco never shuts up. If you watched the live earthquake maps off the Oregon coast for a year, you'd see the Blanco light up again and again. It is, by some measures, the most seismically active fracture zone of its kind in the world's oceans. It doesn't have one earthquake. It has clusters, dozens at a time. Seismologists call them swarms. Back in 2021, the Blanco produced a swarm that made headlines. Dozens of quakes in a matter of days, some of them in the magnitude 5 range, all out in the same offshore zone. The Pacific Northwest Seismic Network, the group of scientists who actually watch this coastline for a living, wrote about it at the time. And their description is the most important sentence in this entire video. They called the swarm, and I'm quoting their own words here, active, unusual, and interesting, but not concerning. Active, unusual, interesting, but not concerning. Sit with that for a second, because it's the exact opposite of how the internet treats every offshore Oregon earthquake. And these scientists weren't being casual, they were being precise. They watch this fault constantly. They've seen it swarm in 2008, in 2015, in 2021. They watched it produce a magnitude 6.1 as recently as October of 2024. And every single time, their conclusion was the same. This is the Blanco being the Blanco. So why does a transform fault behave this way? Why all the noise? Because of how it's built. A transform fault like the Blanco is broken up into a lot of short, separate segments, offset from each other, each one fairly small. So when stress builds up, it doesn't get released in one giant rupture across the whole thing. It gets released piece by piece, segment by segment, in lots of moderate earthquakes. The fault is, in a sense, designed to fail in small pieces. It can't store up the energy for a magnitude 9 even if it wanted to. The geometry won't allow it. The biggest events it produces top out somewhere in the magnitude 6 range, and they happen far offshore, in deep water, on a fault that moves sideways. Add it all up. Here's a number the seismic network has actually run. Take a whole swarm, dozens upon dozens of Blanco earthquakes, and add all their energy together, and the total comes out to roughly the equivalent of a single magnitude 6.3. That's it. All that activity, all those headlines, all that fear, and the combined punch is one moderate quake, released harmlessly, far out at sea. So the Blanco is loud, the Blanco is busy, the Blanco is, frankly, a little bit of a drama queen, and it is not what's going to hurt you. What's going to hurt you is the fault that does the exact opposite, the one that makes no noise at all, the one that's been holding its breath since before the United States existed. And to understand why silence is so much more dangerous than noise, we have to go back to a winter night in the year 1700, and a wave that crossed an entire ocean to leave its signature in the written records of Japan. On the night of January 26th, in the year 1700, something happened off the coast of the Pacific Northwest that no European had written down, because no European was there to see it. There were no instruments, no seismographs, no newspapers. For almost 300 years, this event was effectively invisible to history. And then a handful of scientists found it, not by digging in Oregon, by reading the records of villages in Japan. Here's what happened. On that winter night, the great fault off the coast, the one we're building toward, the Cascadia Subduction Zone, let go along its entire length. Hundreds of miles of locked rock, from northern California to Vancouver Island, slipped at once. The magnitude was somewhere around 9. The coastline dropped. Forests along the shore suddenly sat below sea level, and the salt water rushed in and killed them where they stood. And the sudden upward lurch of the seafloor shoved an enormous volume of ocean into the sky. That water became a tsunami, and it went two directions. One wave came ashore right there, along the Pacific Northwest, in the dark, with no warning. We know it happened because of the stories. The indigenous peoples of the coast, the Quileute, the Huayart, the Makah, and others, carried oral histories of a night the ground shook, and the sea came in, and whole villages were lost. Passed down generation to generation, for 10 generations, until scientists finally sat down and listened, and realized these weren't legends, they were eyewitness accounts. But the other wave is the one that pinned the date, because that second wave traveled west, straight across the Pacific Ocean, for about 10 hours, and it slammed into the coast of Japan in the middle of the night. Now, the Japanese in 1700 were meticulous record keepers, and in villages up and down the coast, people wrote down something baffling: a flood, damaged houses, flooded fields, a wave that came in from the sea, but with no earthquake, no shaking, nothing felt. A tsunami with no parent quake anywhere nearby. They had no idea where it came from. They called it, in the records that survive, an orphan tsunami, a wave with no obvious parent. Almost 3 centuries later, a team of American and Japanese scientists put it together. They took the Japanese flood records, with their careful dates and times. They took the dead trees of the Oregon and Washington coast, and used the rings to pinpoint the exact year they died. And they took the oral histories of the coastal nations. And it all lined up, to the night. The orphan in Japan was the child of Cascadia, January 26, 1700, around 9 o'clock at night. That's how we know. That's the level of detective work it took to find a single earthquake that left no written record on the continent where it struck. And here's why that night matters this morning. Because that was the last time the big fault moved. Not the Blanco, the big one, the subduction zone. It slipped, and it dropped the coast, and it sent a wave to Japan, and then it locked back up. And it has been locked, and loading, and silent, ever since. For more than 325 years. So now you have the contrast. The Blanco, the loud fault, the one that cracked this June morning, has gone off thousands of times since 1700 and never hurt a soul. The Cascadia Subduction Zone, the quiet one, has gone off exactly 0 times in that span. And that, as we're about to see, is not comforting. That's the problem. Remember that number I asked you to hold on to? 218 kilometers offshore. Here's why it matters. The earthquake this June struck way out at the Blanco, far from land. But the Cascadia Subduction Zone, the fault that ended an era in 1700, runs much closer in. It sits roughly 200 kilometers to the east of the Blanco, hugging the edge of the continent, just offshore of Oregon, Washington, and Northern California. It's about 700 miles long, and right now, today, as you watch this, it is locked. Locked means the 2 plates are stuck together. The Juan de Fuca plate is trying to dive under North America, the way it has for millions of years. But along the shallow part of the fault, friction has jammed it. The plates can't slip, so instead, the edge of the continent is being slowly bent, squeezed, compressed. Strain is building in the rock, year after year, the way a bent stick stores energy right before it snaps. And nobody feels a thing. That's the terrifying part. A locked fault is a silent fault. There's no warning swarm of little quakes telling you it's loading. The danger isn't visible. It's the absence of activity that should worry you, not the presence of it. So how often does this fault actually break? The geologists who study it, the ones who've spent decades pulling core samples from the seafloor and digging through coastal marshes, have found evidence of dozens of these great earthquakes stretching back thousands of years. And the average time between the really big, full-length ruptures is somewhere around 500 years. But, and this is important, that's an average, not a schedule. The actual gaps have ranged from as little as a couple hundred years to as much as 1,000. The Earth does not keep a calendar. The United States Geological Survey puts the odds of a magnitude 9 full-margin Cascadia earthquake in the next 50 years at somewhere around 10 to 15%. Let me say that again, because people hear it wrong in both directions. It is not happening tomorrow, and it is not impossible. Roughly a 1 in 7 to 1 in 10 chance in the next 50 years of the single most destructive natural disaster in the history of the United States. And when I say most destructive, I want to be precise about what that means. The Federal Emergency Management Agency has modeled this scenario, a full Cascadia rupture. The estimates that come out of that modeling are sobering, as many as around 14,000 people killed, tens of thousands injured, coastal towns inundated by a tsunami that arrives in 15 to 30 minutes, bridges down, the power grid offline across the Pacific Northwest, parts of the coast cut off entirely for weeks. That is the fault we're talking about. Locked, silent, loading. 200 kilometers from where the Blanco was making noise this June. And the people who study it will tell you the same thing the seismic network said about the Blanco swarm, just flipped on its head. The Blanco was active, unusual, interesting, but not concerning. Cascadia is the opposite. quiet, unremarkable on any given day, and the most concerning fault in the country. But here's where it gets stranger, because Cascadia isn't actually doing nothing, it's doing something. You just can't feel it. And what it's doing might be the most important thing in this entire video. For most of the history of this science, everyone assumed a locked fault was just that. Locked, frozen, doing nothing until the day it broke. Then, in the early 2000s, scientists watching the Cascadia margin with very precise GPS instruments saw something that shouldn't have been possible. The ground was moving, backward. Let me explain. Normally, the squeeze of the locked fault pushes the coast of the Pacific Northwest very slightly inland and up, a few millimeters a year, as the strain builds. But every so often, for a couple of weeks at a time, the GPS stations recorded the land quietly sliding the other way, relaxing, as if a piece of the fault, deep down, had briefly come unstuck and slipped, all on its own, without a single jolt of shaking. They called it slow slip, and paired with it, deep underground, the seismometers picked up a faint, continuous rumbling vibration that could last for days. Not earthquakes, something else, a low tremor. So the whole phenomenon got a name: episodic tremor and slip. Here's why it stops the heart a little. This slow slip happens on the deep part of the fault, just below the locked zone. And every time it slips down there, it transfers a little more stress onto the shallow, locked part above it. The part that's jammed. The part that, when it finally goes, becomes a magnitude 9. So the locked fault isn't waiting passively. It's being loaded, in pulses, from below, silently. And the truly unsettling detail is the rhythm. Under Vancouver Island and the northern stretch of Cascadia, these slow slip events come back on a remarkably regular cycle, roughly every 14 months, like a slow, deep heartbeat under the Pacific Northwest, a pulse you will never feel, that you could never have known about a generation ago, quietly winding the spring of the most dangerous fault in America. This is the threat that doesn't shake, and it's the whole reason the Blanco earthquake this June is the wrong thing to be scared of. Because when people see a magnitude 5.5 off Oregon, they think, that's the pressure releasing, that's energy coming out, maybe that's good. And on the Blanco, sure, it is. But the fault that actually threatens you doesn't release its pressure in earthquakes you can see. It loads up in silence, 14 months at a time, in a motion no human being can sense, and gives back nothing until the day it gives back everything. A loud fault that hurts no one. A silent fault that's been loading for 3 centuries. Now you understand which one the scientists watch, and it isn't the one that made the news. So that leaves the question everybody actually wants answered. The Blanco moved. It's right there in the same corner of the Pacific. Can one fault wake the other? Can the loud one set off the quiet one? It's the right question, and the answer involves a plate that one team of scientists described, in plain English, as soft and weak. This is the question that drives every viral video, every comment section panic, every late-night spiral. The Blanco cracks, and someone asks, did that just put pressure on Cascadia? Are we one offshore swarm away from setting off the big one? Let's answer it properly, with physics, not vibes. Earthquakes can influence each other, that's real. When a fault slips, it changes the stress on the rock around it. Sometimes that nudges a nearby fault a little closer to failure. Scientists take this seriously, and they measure it. So the question isn't crazy. The question is whether the Blanco, specifically, can meaningfully load Cascadia, specifically. And the evidence says no, for 2 solid reasons. The first is distance and direction. The Blanco is about 200 kilometers from the Cascadia locked zone, and it moves sideways, in deep ocean, on a transform fault. The stress changes from a magnitude 5 or 6 fade out fast with distance. By the time you're 200 kilometers away, at the part of Cascadia that actually matters, the nudge from a Blanco quake is vanishingly small. Remember that number from earlier? A whole swarm of Blanco events, dozens of them, adds up to about the energy of a single magnitude 6.3. And historically, when those swarms happen, the seismic networks see no measurable uptick in Cascadia activity afterward. None. The loud fault talks, the quiet fault ignores it. The second reason is the rock itself. The little plate between the Blanco and the continent, the Juan de Fuca plate, is young and warm and, geologically speaking, not very stiff. Researchers at the University of Oregon studying this exact system have described that plate as soft and weak. And a soft, weak plate is a bad messenger. It doesn't transmit stress efficiently across that 200-kilometer gap. It absorbs it, deforms, soaks it up. So even the small nudge the Blanco might send eastward gets muffled before it ever reaches the locked door of Cascadia. Put those together and you get the scientific consensus. Stated plainly, the Blanco earthquake this June did not meaningfully load the Cascadia Subduction Zone. It was the Blanco being the Blanco. The two faults are neighbors, but they are not partners. Now I promised you the truth, and the truth has a wrinkle, so here it is honestly. There is real, active scientific debate about whether Cascadia's great earthquakes might be linked to ruptures on a different fault, far to the south, the northern end of the San Andreas. Not the Blanco, the San Andreas. And brand new research, published just this year, has been digging into evidence buried in the seafloor that hints these two giants may, sometimes, have gone off almost together. That's a genuine open question at the frontier of this science, and it's a far more interesting one than anything you'll find in a doomsday thumbnail. So let's go there next, because that buried evidence, the stuff scientists pull up from the bottom of the ocean in long tubes of mud, is how we know almost everything about a fault that has only broken once in recorded history. I told you the truth has a wrinkle. This is the wrinkle, and it comes from mud. For decades, a marine geologist at Oregon State University named Chris Goldfinger has been doing something that sounds almost boring and turns out to be one of the most important detective stories in earthquake science. He pulls long tubes of sediment up from the bottom of the ocean off the west coast, cores, columns of mud and sand laid down layer by layer over thousands of years. Here's why that matters. When a great earthquake hits the seafloor, it shakes loose huge underwater landslides. Mud and sand go tumbling down the submarine slopes and settle out in a very particular pattern. Coarse, heavy grains on the bottom, fine, light silt on top. That single deposited layer is called a turbidite, and every great earthquake leaves one. So if you pull up a core and count the turbidites, you're literally counting earthquakes, going back in time, thousands of years. That's how we know Cascadia's rough 500-year rhythm in the first place. Goldfinger helped establish it. Now here's where it gets strange. The whole thing started with an accident. Back in 1999, on a research cruise, Goldfinger's team drifted off course. A navigational error carried them about 55 miles south of Cape Mendocino into the zone of a completely different fault, the northern end of the San Andreas. They figured, well, we're here, let's take a core anyway. And what they pulled up was wrong. The layering was upside down, coarse sand sitting on top of fine silt, the opposite of normal, as if not one earthquake but two had struck this spot in quick succession. A first quake laying down the fine layer, and then, right on top of it, before the mud had even settled, a second quake from a different fault laying down the coarse one. They call these doublets, and in research published recently in the journal Geosphere, Goldfinger and his colleagues laid out the case. Combing through about 3,100 years of seafloor history, near the point where Cascadia and the northern San Andreas actually meet, they found these paired, inverted layers again and again. And their best explanation is unsettling. In at least 3 cases over the past 1,500 years, including the Great Earthquake of 1700, the data suggest that Cascadia and the northern San Andreas may have ruptured within minutes to hours of each other. Let that sink in. Not the Blanco nudging Cascadia. That doesn't happen. But Cascadia and the San Andreas, the two most famous faults in America, possibly going off as a pair. Now Goldfinger himself is careful, and so am I. This is a hypothesis, built on interpreting mud, and pinning the exact timing is genuinely hard. It is not a prediction. Nobody is saying this will happen next. What the science is saying is that the worst-case scenario for the West Coast might be bigger than a lone Cascadia quake. As Goldfinger put it, the Big One might not be the worst case. It might come with a partner. That's the real frontier. not a fracture zone setting off a megathrust. Two megathrust scale systems hundreds of miles apart that may share a heartbeat we're only now learning to hear. And the place where they meet, where this whole mystery was born, has already given us a preview of what that corner of the coast can do. In 1992, in daylight, on camera, it was a warm spring morning, April 25, 1992, just after 11 o'clock, near the tiny town of Petrolia on California's remote Lost Coast. This is the exact spot where three faults collide: the Cascadia Subduction Zone, the San Andreas, and an offshore fracture zone, all meeting at a single chaotic point called the Mendocino Triple Junction, the same triple junction where Goldfinger's accidental core came from. And that morning, the ground there delivered the strongest shaking ever recorded in California up to that point. The main shock was a magnitude 7.2. It was a thrust earthquake, the kind where one block of crust is shoved up and over another. The rupture started onshore, about 6 miles down, and drove seaward, lifting the coastline. In some places, the shore rose by more than 3 feet in an instant. Tide pools that had been underwater that morning were suddenly dry land. The town of Petrolia was hammered. Up the coast, in the community of Scotia, the shaking sparked a fire that burned down a business district. Across Humboldt County, homes came off their foundations. As many as around 350 people were hurt. And then, the next morning, the fault wasn't done. 2 more big aftershocks, both around magnitude 6.6, struck offshore on April 26th, on steep faults in the Gorda Plate. Over the following days, the region logged more than 2,000 aftershocks. The ground simply would not settle. Here's the part that connects straight back to our story. That magnitude 7.2 lifted the seafloor, and that vertical motion launched a tsunami. A small one, by the standards of what Cascadia could do. But it was real, and it was measured. Tide gauges picked up that wave not just along the California and Oregon coast, but all the way across the Pacific in Hawaii. A magnitude 7 thrust quake at the Triple Junction sent a measurable wave to the Hawaiian Islands. Now scale that up in your mind. 1992 was a magnitude 7 on the very southern tip of the Cascadia system, lifting the seafloor a few feet and sending a modest wave to Hawaii. The 1700 event was a magnitude 9 along the entire length of the fault, and it sent a wave that flooded villages in Japan 10 hours later. The difference between those two is not small. A magnitude 9 releases something like 1,000 times the energy of a magnitude 7. So when scientists watched a magnitude 5.5 crack the Blanco this June, far offshore, on a sideways sliding fault that lifts nothing, they weren't being complacent. They've seen what the dangerous faults in this region actually do. They've seen Petrolia. They've read the orphan tsunami records. They know the difference between a fault that shakes a fishing town and a fault that drowns a coastline. And they know the difference matters more than the magnitude on the screen. Which raises the question every person living on that coast eventually asks: when the real one comes, how much warning will I actually get? Let's answer that honestly, because the answer is 2 different numbers, and confusing them can cost lives. The first number is seconds. The United States now runs an earthquake early warning system on the West Coast called Shake Alert, built by the Geological Survey. Here's how it works. When a fault ruptures, it sends out 2 kinds of waves: a fast, weak wave that does little damage, and a slower, violent wave that does. Shake Alert sensors catch that first fast wave, instantly calculate that a big quake has started, and fire off an alert that races ahead at the speed of light, faster than the damaging shaking can travel. If you're far enough from the epicenter, that alert can reach your phone seconds, sometimes tens of seconds, before the ground starts to roll. Seconds. That doesn't sound like much, but seconds are enough to drop, cover, and hold on. Enough for a surgeon to lift the scalpel, enough for a train to start braking, for a gas line to trip shut, for a kid to get under a desk. Seconds save lives, but seconds are all the warning the shaking itself will give you. The second number is the one that matters on the coast, and it's not seconds. It's minutes, because after a great Cascadia rupture, the shaking is just the opening act. The tsunami comes next, and on the outer coast of the Pacific Northwest, that wave doesn't take 10 hours to arrive the way it did in Japan. Japan was across the ocean, you'd be right on top of it. The first surge could reach the beaches of Oregon and Washington in as little as 15 to 30 minutes. That's your warning, not a phone alert, the shaking itself. If you are ever on that coast and the ground rolls hard for more than a minute, that is the warning. There may be no time for sirens, no time for an official message, no cell service left at all. The rule the emergency agencies drill into coastal communities is brutally simple. If the shaking is long and strong, get to high ground and go on foot. Don't wait. Don't drive. The earthquake is the alarm, and the clock is 15 to 30 minutes long. So put the two numbers together, because this is the practical heart of the whole video. Inland shake alert may give you a precious few seconds before the shaking. On the coast, the long shaking itself gives you 15 to 30 minutes before the water. One is technology, the other is your own two legs and the decision to trust them. And this is exactly why the Blanco earthquake this June was the wrong thing to fear and the right thing to learn from. It cracked far offshore, lifted nothing, threatened no one, and gave the warning centers an easy all clear. The fault that will actually test those 15 minutes hasn't moved since 1700. It's still locked, still loading, still silent. And no amount of fear pointed at the wrong fault will buy you a single second when the right one finally lets go. Now, about all that fear, because the internet has a very different story about what happened off Oregon this June, and it's time to take it apart. Here's what the internet did with this earthquake. Within hours of the Blanco cracking off Oregon, the videos started. The ground is opening up. The big one is here. Pressure is transferring. And 3 specific claims spread faster than the facts ever could. So let's take them one at a time, with physics, and put each one down. Claim 1. A magnitude 5.5 off Oregon means the Cascadia Big One is imminent. We've already buried this one, but let me drive the nail all the way in. The Blanco is a transform fault. It slides sideways, far offshore, in deep water, and it has done so thousands of times since 1700. The seismic network has measured it. A whole swarm of these quakes, dozens of them, adds up to about the energy of a single magnitude 6.3, and historically those swarms are followed by no measurable change in Cascadia at all. The soft, weak Juan Fuca plate in between doesn't carry the stress across. So a Blanco quake telling you the big one is coming is like a car door slamming down the street telling you your own house is about to collapse. They're not connected. The fault that cracked is not the fault that's loaded. Claim 2. This will cause a tsunami. Watch the coast this weekend. No, and the reason is the single most useful thing in this whole video. To make a tsunami, you have to move water vertically. You need the seafloor to suddenly jump up or drop down, lifting the whole column of ocean above it. A subduction quake does that. A transform fault, sliding sideways, does not. It shifts the ground horizontally, like sliding a book across a table. The water above barely notices. That's exactly why the National Tsunami Warning Center issued the all-clear within minutes. It wasn't luck, and it wasn't a guess. It's geometry. Sideways motion doesn't raise the sea. Claim 3, and this is the strangest one. The pressure is moving inland. It's heading for Yellowstone. The supervolcano is next. Now this one isn't even tectonically coherent, but it spreads every single time anything moves on the west coast, so it deserves a real answer. There is no mechanism by which a small offshore strike-slip earthquake transmits pressure 600 miles inland into a volcanic system. Stress changes from a magnitude 5 fade to nothing within a few dozen miles. And we don't have to argue it in theory, because Yellowstone is one of the most heavily instrumented pieces of ground on the planet. The most recent update from the Yellowstone Volcano Observatory logged 45 small earthquakes in a month, the largest a magnitude 2.0, a tremor you couldn't feel if you were standing on it. The caldera has shown no uplift and no subsidence since December. The alert level is normal. The aviation code is green. The supervolcano is, by every instrument we have, asleep. An offshore quake in Oregon did not and cannot poke it. So that's all 3, down. And here's the part I always come back to on this channel. People reach for these stories because a hidden pattern, a secret connection, a building pressure, feels less frightening than the truth, because a pattern implies a logic, a schedule, something you could see coming. But the real science is more unsettling than that. The Blanco will keep cracking, harmlessly, forever. And Cascadia will break when it breaks, loaded in silence by a slow pulse no one can feel, on no schedule any human will ever read. There's no pattern to crack, no signal in the offshore quakes. No one is steering this. That's the actual terror of it, not a conspiracy, an indifference. The ground does not owe us a warning, so strip away the fear, and what are we actually left with? What happens next, in the real world, on the real coast? Here's the honest forecast. The Blanco Fracture Zone will keep doing exactly what it did this June. It'll go quiet for a while, then swarm, then go quiet again. There will be more magnitude 5s out there, probably more 6s in the years ahead. They'll make the local news, they'll trigger another round of panic videos, and they'll hurt no one. That's not a failure of the fault. That's the fault working exactly as its geometry demands. Meanwhile, 200 kilometers closer to shore, the Cascadia Subduction Zone will keep doing what it's done since 1700. Nothing you can see. The plates stay locked, the strain keeps building, and every 14 months or so, deep underneath, that slow slip pulse will release, transfer a little more stress to the locked zone above, and load the spring a single notch tighter, silently, while you sleep, while the Blanco makes all the noise offshore. And the scientists? They're not watching the Blanco for clues about Cascadia, because there aren't any. They're watching the things that actually matter, the GPS stations measuring the slow bending of the coast, the instruments listening for the deep tremor of the next slow slip event, a growing network of sensors on the ocean floor itself, right above the locked zone, because that's where the only real warning will ever come from. They're refining the seismic record, including that new doublet research, to understand whether the worst case is one giant or two. This is what real vigilance looks like. It's quiet, it's patient, it's pointed at the silent fault, not the loud one. That's the discipline this whole topic demands, and it's the discipline this channel tries to model. Don't watch the fault that's shouting, watch the one that's holding its breath. Because here's where it all lands. The danger in the Pacific Northwest was never the earthquake you can feel 135 miles offshore. It was always the one you won't feel coming at all. Let's bring it home. On June 29th, a magnitude 5.5 cracked the Blanco Fracture Zone off the coast of Oregon. It was loud, it was offshore, it lifted nothing, it threatened no one, and it was the Blanco being the Blanco. It was not the big one, it was not a tsunami trigger, it was not pressure moving toward Yellowstone, it was a sideways slip on a fault that's been slipping harmlessly for longer than this country has existed. The fault that actually matters made no sound that day, and it's still making no sound right now. So if you live anywhere on that coast, here's the only takeaway that's worth your time, and it's not fear. It's the opposite. It's a plan. Download the Shake Alert-powered earthquake warning app for your state, because a few seconds is worth having. If you're on the coast, learn your evacuation route to high ground today while it's a calm afternoon, because when the moment comes there won't be time to look it up, and the shaking itself will be your only warning. Keep some water, some food, a way to stay warm. Not because the sky is falling, because the smartest people studying this fault have given you a number, 10 to 15% in the next 50 years, and a plan is just what you do with a number like that. And then, here's the hard part. You go on with your life, because that's the real lesson of the silent fault. It doesn't reward worry. It doesn't care how scared you are. It's been loading for 325 years, and it will let go on its own schedule, indifferent to every one of us. The only thing in your control is whether you're ready. So get ready, and then go live. The clock is still running, we just can't read it. If this changed how you think about that coastline, you already know what to do. Subscribe so the next one finds you. And here's the question I can't stop thinking about, the one we're chasing next. We talked tonight about how Cascadia and the San Andreas might be linked, might break almost together. But there's a deeper mystery in that mud Goldfinger pulls up from the seafloor. 3,000 years of earthquakes recorded in layers of sand, and a pattern in them that may mean the Pacific Northwest has a rhythm we're only beginning to hear. So how do you read 3,000 years of earthquakes written in the bottom of the ocean? And what is that record quietly trying to tell us about the next one? That's where we're going. I'll see you there.